Okay, thank you everybody for attending tonight. Hello, my name is Valdi Wiederpass. I serve as a volunteer in the position of chair of Susquehanna Group of Sierra Club. Um, and welcome to tonight's general membership meeting. And this is going to feature a talk by Renee Seacor on wild canis in the Northeast. And what we mean by that is coyotes and wolves, basically, at least for the focus of this talk. These meetings are free and open to the public. You don't have to be a member of the Sierra Club to attend, but we do encourage membership as it helps us by providing funding for our activities and letting us know your contact information so we can update you on important matters. And before we go much further, is this being recorded? Yes? Okay, good. All right, just wanted to make sure. All right.
Yes, yes.
All right, thank you. We do have calendars for sale. These are Sierra Club glossy color photograph calendars. They're beautiful. There's the wall calendar available as well as a like an appointment style calendar. They're each $18 plus $5 for shipping, so it would be $23. The check should be written out to Sierra Club Susquehanna Group, and you can mail that to Sierra Club Susquehanna Group at Post Office Box 572, Endicott, New York 13760. They make good Christmas gifts if you're thinking about something to give that people will actually use. Also, we welcome volunteers to help us, and we are still looking for volunteers specifically for two things. Number one, you don't have to be a member of the executive committee to serve as our group's secretary, and we have been asking for this for over a year now. We still need a secretary to help us take notes when we have our executive committee meetings, and the executive committee is a group of volunteers who have run for office by submitting candidate statements, which should be 150 words long. So if you want to join our executive committee, please submit a candidate statement expressing why you want to join, why you care about the environment, how you think you can help us, and do that within the next few days, certainly by the end of this week or by Monday, the absolute latest. And you can send those by email to Jim Taft 7@gmail.com. So JIMT as in Tom, AF as in Frank, T as in Tom, 7@gmail.com. So please consider that. We meet, meaning the executive committee meetings are generally the first Tuesday of the month. We try to keep the meetings at no more than 1.5 hours, but sometimes they stretch a little longer. And we take a break for 2 months in the summer. So this is typically the first Tuesday of every month, except for 2 months of the year, unless we have some real emergency that we need to call another meeting. We sometimes move that meeting depending on holidays or election day or whatever. So that helps set the focus of this Susquehanna Group of Sierra Club and what we work on and authorize and take votes on important matters, positions we might take on what New York State is doing, and also funding, how we spend our funds. Those types of decisions are what we do. So it works on democracy, majority vote of the executive committee members. So that's the purpose of the executive committee, and we do encourage you to please send in a candidate statement if you are willing to help us by volunteering for that. And then the membership actually votes for people that submitted their candidate statements. So just because you submit a candidate statement doesn't mean you automatically get to join. But so far, very few people have sent in candidate statements. So the likelihood is that if you submit a candidate statement, you might have a good chance of being on the executive committee. All right, so sorry to spend so much time on that, but it is very important. Also, just a reminder, the September edition of the Susquehanna Sierran, which is our group's newsletter, has been posted to our website. And you can search online for Sierra Club Susquehanna Group and you'll find our website. and that website has past recordings of meetings as well as some of the slide presentation files as well. So you can review those. And the newsletters are on there. And there's also an events calendar that shows major things happening with our group as well as other groups in the area. So that's something useful as well. And
Baldy,
yes,
can I interrupt for a second?
sure.
The December newsletter is forthcoming soon, and there's still some space for an article or two if anybody wants to spend maybe 250 words in a graphic and send it to me at that same address. Then we can, after editing, and perhaps after editing, we can include it in the newsletter. The newsletter this time will be printed because it will also contain the ballots for the upcoming election. So great, colorful graphics would not be good for this newsletter, but they are for the other quarterly newsletters throughout the year, which are electronic.
Yes, thank you, Jim, for that reminder. So, and those ballots are for electing executive committee members for the upcoming term that starts in January of next year. So that's going to be part of that. And Jim does a great job. Again, thank you. Much appreciation to Jim for being a fantastic newsletter editor and compiling and formatting that newsletter and sending it out to people. And also I want to thank, go ahead.
I'm going to say, and the content can be anything that relates to the mission of the Sierra Club, which is one of the shortest and sweetest mission statements that I know of. It's to explore, enjoy, and protect our planet.
Yes, very good. That is what we're about. So but it covers a lot of things, a lot of very important things. Okay, let's see. Oh, I want to thank Maura Ashley too for all her great work in getting speakers as well as improving our presence on our website and also on the events calendar. So thank you for all that work. I really appreciate it. All right. And also thank you to Scott and Kathy for organizing the our group for the riverbank cleanup that happened early in October. That was a success. We collected a lot of trash and some heavy things as well. So I think there was close to maybe 8 or 10 garbage bags full. Some of them were pretty heavy to haul. So that was a good effort. Thank you, Scott. Okay, I think we're got one more thing. Sorry. I'm not going to delve into politics here, but the net result of it is that we have even more work to do and we need to push even harder. So please, anybody that cares about saving a habitable climate and environmental protection in New York State, please at least call or send an email or otherwise contact your elected officials in New York State and tell them that you see climate change as a priority to help save a habitable climate, and you want urgent actions on that. You want a transition that's speedy and just in terms of environmental justice to an electrified economy based on renewable energy. You don't want to see nuclear power. There's a big problem with that. We're going to put out some information about that. There's an action item that was sent out by email. So if you look up Allison Samuel, Sierra Club, as the originator of the email, and then the subject is "Tell New York State we need a robust energy plan." That will take you to a website where there's some existing paragraphs that explain what we're after from New York State, and then you can modify that and add your own personal note to it as well. So I recommend you do that if you want to spend a little bit of time to help us out. New York State is 3 years behind on meeting its 2030 climate goals, And there was an article in the September newsletter for our group that talked about that. All right. So also, upcoming general meetings, just so you're aware, December 17th is our next meeting after tonight. And that's Michelle Neupfer of Waterman Conservation Education Center. She's going to be talking about bird-friendly backyards. And then January 21st of 2025, we'll have Tom Powell, who is a Binghamton University biology professor, giving a talk on the effects of climate change on insects. And we're working on some other ones too, but they're not fully finalized yet. Tonight's presentation will be by Renee Seacor. She will cover wolf recovery in the Northeast, including the emerging science on the genetics of coyotes and wolves in the region, and the need for habitat connectivity and how it increasingly converges with public policy. Renee Seacor currently serves as Carnivore Conservation Director at Project Coyote, where she works to advocate and advance policy solutions aimed at compassionately coexisting with our wild carnivore neighbors nationwide. Renee is an interdisciplinary environmental advocate with a background in wildlife ecology and environmental law and policy. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from Rocky Mountain College in Montana and a JD with a concentration in environmental law from the University of Oregon School of Law. Thank you, Renee, for agreeing to give this talk, and I turn it over to you now.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for that great introduction. And also, you guys, it sounds like you are doing a lot and have a lot of really interesting presentations. So I appreciate you carving out some time for me to chat about wolves and coyotes tonight. So I'll jump right into it. My name is Renee Seacor. Like my introduction said, I'm the Carnivore Conservation Director at Project Coyote. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Project Coyote. We are a national nonprofit. We originally were founded in California, so our work in the last several years has really expanded into the Northeast. I'm actually based in New York, so excited to see the work of this organization come into the Northeast, United States. Our mission, as much as I wish it was as short and sweet as the Sierra Club's, it's a little bit more of a tongue twister. We work to protect North American wild carnivores and promote compassionate coexistence through education, science, advocacy, and coalition building. So not as short and sweet, a little more focused on wild carnivore protection specifically. And the reason that we do that, our aim is really fundamentally to shift the way that carnivore species like coyotes, wolves, bears, bobcats, and others are viewed and treated in society in order to create a North America where humans and wild carnivores can coexist and where ecosystems can thrive. And I'll get a bit into kind of, the ecological benefits of species like coyotes and wolves on the landscape. So our programs and campaigns at Project Coyote really run the gamut from advocacy campaigns focused on things like banning wildlife killing contests, which some of you might be familiar with. That work that happened in New York specifically last legislative session. These were competitive events that targeted species like coyotes and foxes, primarily coyotes, but other species as well, where folks would award prizes, and typically cash prizes and trophies for killing the most coyotes or the largest coyote. The good news is those were banned in New York, and that bill actually took effect on November 1st. So it took a long time from the date the bill was signed in order to take effect, but it took effect this month, which is really amazing. So wildlife killing contests are now banned statewide. But our organization also works on more educational and outreach focused work, getting into communities and teaching them how to compassionately and effectively coexist with species like coyotes and other carnivores, and really inspire appreciation for wild nature with collaborations with educators and creatives and whatnot. So real diversity of programs and campaigns, but all aimed at really fostering that coexistence with North American carnivores. just a brief background. Like I said, I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up in the lower Hudson Valley in Westchester County. And I now live a little further north in Dutchess County. So I now call it upstate. I know the upstate downstate line is a little controversial of a subject sometimes. I consider it upstate in the northern, mid Hudson Valley region. And so, yeah, like my introduction said, my background is a bit in the wildlife ecology and sciences. And I spent quite a few, 10 plus years living out west, studying wildlife species in the greater Yellowstone River ecosystem, which is really where I fell in love with wolves, coyotes, bears, and kind of the full suite of native wild carnivores that exist in Yellowstone, which is really unique in the sense that they have, grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions, and populations that are really unaffected in most ways by humans living inside Yellowstone National Park. So it's really exciting to get to observe that ecosystem. And that's really where I grew very fond of these large carnivore species and the effect that they have on ecosystems and ecosystem health in particular. So that was a bit lengthy of an intro, but we'll dive into the talk now. So I'm going to kind of go back, give a historical perspective of wolves in North America. I'm going to try to keep this brief, but I think it's important as we start to talk about thinking about wolves in the Northeast to reflect on where and why we are in the current state of where we are with wolves who were once native to the region, no longer roaming across the Northeast. So this might be repetitive for some folks, but important to ground ourselves in this history and how it relates to where we're at today. So historically, wolves ranged throughout most of North America. This map shows their historical range, so pre-1800s. And then during the 19th and 20th centuries, wolves and wild carnivores in general faced what were known as predator extermination campaigns through the middle of the last century. So this was a targeted eradication effort in order to wipe wolves and bears and other carnivore species off the landscape. And there was a few reasons for this. One of those reasons was European worldviews that really devalued and vilified wolves. Wolves were often portrayed as dangerous, evil creatures in European folklore and culture, which was a perception that unfortunately carried over to the Americas and fueled fears and kind of justified these extermination efforts. They were also perceived as a threat to domesticated farm animals, and somehow also perceived as a threat to wild ungulate species or game species that humans obviously had an interest in preserving, despite predator and prey species being able to maintain a natural balance for thousands of years prior to European colonization. They still were perceived as a threat to those species. And so unfortunately, these fears and misconceptions led to both federal and state governments issuing what were known as bounties, so paying private actors to kill wolves, grizzly bears, black bears, coyotes, and receive payments in order to do so. So it really incentivized widespread wolf killing, and the federal government's involvement in predator control really solidified the campaign against wolves, turning it into, unfortunately, a systematic extermination effort. And so this led to the eradication of almost all wolves from the lower 48 by the 1930s, and only a handful of gray wolves were left by the 1970s in Minnesota and really the upper reaches of the upper peninsula of Michigan. So after eradicating wolves from most of North America, and I think I actually have to flip to, so after eradicating wolves from most of North America, scientific discoveries between essentially the 1930s to the 1960s really began to uncover the ecological value of wolves, and really of all top carnivores to ecosystems. And we started to see the effect of wolves' absence from the landscape, which allowed prey species like deer and elk to overpopulate and ultimately negatively alter ecosystems. And so around this time, we discovered essentially the concept of a keystone species, which helps maintain the balance of an entire environment by keeping lower trophic levels in check. And so we're keeping kind of prey populations healthy and preventing things like overgrazing, which in turn increases biodiversity of ecosystems. And so these scientific discoveries really started to argue for the protection of wolves and their populations to benefit ecosystems at large. So this is when we began to kind of change the narrative, at least within our federal wildlife agencies, and had an interest in seeing wolves reintroduced into North America. And so this protection for wolves was essentially achieved with the signing of the Endangered Species Act in 1973. And this ultimately led to reintroduction efforts, primarily in the Northern Rockies, where most folks are familiar with the Yellowstone reintroduction of wolves in the 1990s. So in 1995, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone and Idaho. And at that same time, there were other reintroduction efforts of Mexican gray wolves, which is a subspecies of gray wolf, into the Southwest, so into Arizona and New Mexico. And then red wolves were introduced into a small Alligator River wildlife refuge on the coast of North Carolina starting in 1987. So this was really the era of reintroduction. These reintroductions were, I say, successful, but to an extent. We saw wolves slowly be able to recolonize a portion of their range, but they're now, their range is about 10% of what that former range was. So still very limited on kind of that first map that I showed of their extensive range pre kind of European colonization. So this started to shift in the early 2000s when there began really relentless attempts by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with different administration changes, really efforts to delist wolves both regionally and nationally. And this started to affect the Northeast, which in the 90s and the early 2000s was actually considered for a potential wolf reintroduction. There were feasibility studies that were done in the region, Adirondack Park in particular, and there were coalitions that were pushing for active reintroductions in Adirondack Park, and some of you might be familiar with those efforts that were happening around that time. But as wolves began to recover in the Northern Rocky Mountains and the Great Lakes, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service essentially delisted wolves, began to attempt to delist wolves, and essentially lumped the Northeast into the Great Lakes for consideration of recovery of the species. And so essentially started to write off the Northeast as a potential recovery area. And there was a lot of back and forth on different rules and regulations that were adopted, and I'm not going to go into the specifics of those. But one of the questions that did arise at that time in particular, as we were thinking about reintroduction, was what wolf species was native to the region, and what about the coyotes that had, in the absence of wolves, started to recolonize the region. And did coyotes start to fill the ecological role that wolves once had? And so these were questions that were kind of being discussed at the time, and I'll delve into a little bit of that genetic and ecological science a little bit later in this talk, but I just want to highlight that point because we'll be circling back on it. And then more recently, in 2021, when Trump administration was in the last time they were in office, just before departing, their U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stripped all gray wolves Endangered Species Act protection, essentially turning over wolf management to the states, which ended up being very deadly for wolves in the Great Lakes region. In Wisconsin, they immediately opened a wolf hunt and killed 25% of their wolf population in just a matter of days. And so this also meant that wolves in the Northeast were delisted at the time. This was fortunately overturned in federal court in early 2022. So wolves at the current moment are federally listed as endangered. I say that with a massive caveat that we're headed into another administration that historically has not treated wolves positively. So they're definitely at stake. But for now, the gray wolf does at this moment remain listed as endangered, including in the Northeast United States. And so there really has been no commitment by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to take any steps toward wolf recovery in the Northeast in the more recent future, and in the more recent past. So over the last probably decade or so, there's been a ton of studies that have looked at wolf habitat in the Northeast, and have continued to highlight that there is suitable habitat in the Northeast for large carnivore recovery. But also at the same time, there's obviously growing concern over continued loss of habitat, particularly when thinking about connectivity between core habitat patches, as well as dispersal corridors for large carnivores like wolves or mountain lions to be able to move from habitat patches. And so really sustain healthy population dispersal corridors are so important. But despite continuing land use change, suitable areas definitely in the Northeast have been identified and definitely do remain. And numerous studies have identified that wolves and mountain lions in particular, these are kind of the species that these studies have looked at, that there are core habitats that could sustain populations of these species. So I'll highlight one study published in 2022, which concluded that there were conservatively more than 17,000 square miles of potential wolf habitat throughout New England, and over 5,700 square miles of core suitable habitat in New York alone. But these are core habitat patches, and this is a study that looked at showing a comparison of all studies that have really looked at models of wolf habitat across the US, and you can see that numerous have identified the Northeast having suitable habitat. But obviously these are core habitat patches, and what's needed between core patches is really thinking about corridors for connectivity and dispersal of large carnivores. Wolves are very large roaming species. They, can disperse hundreds of miles, and they're territorial. And so really vast interconnected landscape is necessary for their kind of flourishing within an ecosystem. And so thinking about these corridors is exceptionally important whenever thinking about a large carnivore species. And there's one in particular, and I don't know if you can see my mouth, but in between the Adirondacks and southeastern Canada is one of particular importance, considering that the closest breeding population of wolves does exist in Algonquin Provincial Park, which is roughly 100 miles from, give or take, from the New York border. So that connectivity in particular is a real important wildlife corridor to continue protecting in order to allow future potential wolf recolonization. So I'm going to shift gears now, and you really can't talk about wolves in the Northeast without getting into like a little bit of taxonomic and genetic science and talking about these guys, the cousin to the wolf, the coyote. So I'm going to try to keep this brief, one, because I'm not a canid genetic scientist, so I don't want to say anything that's incorrect, but also because Canis taxonomy could be like an hour-long talk by itself. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. But while this colonial war on wolves was happening and wolves started disappearing from the landscape in the Northeast, in particular, coyotes actually went in the opposite direction and had a range expansion. And so this wasn't because coyotes weren't targeted during those predator extermination campaigns that I mentioned. They were aggressively targeted just as much as wolves. They were hunted, trapped, poisoned, but certain factors actually led to them persisting in the face of these aggressive hunting and trapping campaigns. And so a few of the reasons for that was that coyotes and wolves are both territorial species, And so as wolves were wiped off the landscape, coyotes actually were able to expand their territories into kind of the absence of the presence of wolves. And so they really don't overlap territories very often. And so as wolves were pushed out of the landscape, coyotes were able to expand their range. Their social structure in particular for coyotes actually allows them to have immense flexibility and adapt to different landscapes. So essentially coyotes have what's called fission fusion. So they can live solitarily, but they can also pack up when it's more expedient to them. Whereas wolves are pack, very social animals that have deep pack dynamics and need packs in order to survive and hunt. And so coyotes' kind of flexibility in their social structure allowed them to live in a variety of different environments, whereas wolves really kind of suffered, unfortunately. And then another interesting thing about coyotes is that they have a very unique reproductive response to human-caused mortality, which is actually to increase reproduction. So the more that we hunt and trap and kill them, the more offspring they actually have. And I won't get into the biological mechanisms of this, but it did result in coyotes actually being able to overcome and persist in the face of really intense persecution. It's estimated that at the current moment, 500,000 coyotes are killed in the US every year. And they're still, thriving in mostly every major city in the lower 48. So this allowed coyotes to move into the Northeast. And at that time, wolves remained in Canada, including eastern wolves, which are, I'll kind of get into that, but in the southeastern part of Canada, where I kind of chatted about that, the closest population of wolves is actually, they're known as eastern wolves. Some scientists, there's a bit of a debate whether they're their own separate species or whether they're a subspecies of gray wolf. But either way, they had populations in and around southeastern Canada. And so as wolves were kind of disappearing from the landscape was the same kind of time that coyotes were expanding their range. And there was a bit of collision that occurred and a mixing and mingling of coyotes, eastern wolves, as well as gray wolves. So that brings us to our kind of resident canid today, which is a little unique in that sense. Again, wild canis taxonomy is definitely complicated and thoroughly debated and discussed in the literature, but I just wanted to give kind of an overview of wolf species and subspecies in the US. So this is a chart that shows kind of the comparison between canis species. So you can see that Western coyotes in particular, about 20 to 30 pounds, as compared to Eastern coyotes, which are 32 to 45 pounds, some even getting up to in the 50-pound range. And then there is Eastern wolves, which is that population that I was talking about in Southeastern Canada, which is up for debate whether that's a separate species or a subspecies. Some scientists say one way, some say the other. I will note that in Canada, they are classified as their own separate species. In the US, Eastern wolves are considered a subspecies of gray wolf. And then in the Great Lakes region, you have what are known as Great Lakes wolves, and is essentially kind of a cross between Eastern wolves and then the gray wolf, which is that larger body wolf that was reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park and now roams throughout the Western United States. So there's definitely a lot of variability between canis across North America. But I just wanted to show that to kind of show, the difference in sizes and comparison between these species. So that brings us to our resident canid, the Eastern coyote. And all of you obviously are likely familiar with coyotes in the Northeast and in New York, but these guys are definitely a little bit more than meets the eye. Their DNA tells that really fascinating story of range shifting between coyotes and wolves. And in the face of kind of habitat change and persecution by humans, there's been admixture that's occurred between wolves and coyotes. And so some actually call our Eastern coyote Eastern coyote, some say Northeastern coyote, And then some even use, you might have heard of the term coy wolf. And that's essentially trying to get at the genetic uniqueness of our existing coyotes as compared to their Western counterparts, which are, 99% coyote DNA, where in the Northeast, there's much more variability. So this graphic actually shows the results of a really, at the time, I think it was early 2000s, was a groundbreaking study that compared, and I'll just show you the graphic that displays this data. But at the time, it compared essentially over 400 canids, and 200 of which were from the Northeast United States, and it compared their DNA to in relation to a variety of Canis species. So looking at gray wolf, eastern wolf, western coyote, and then dog DNA. And it found that on average, canids in the region had about 62 to 65% coyote DNA, and then about 15% western gray wolf DNA, and about 15% eastern wolf DNA, and then roughly 10% dog was also in there. So a bit of a hodgepodge of DNA. And this was on average, and there are individuals that had higher percentages of wolf DNA, higher percentages of coyote DNA, but this is kind of the average of that study at the time. So this means that there's a ton of variability in our eastern coyote. And these are all images of coyotes throughout the Northeast, from New Hampshire, Connecticut. People send us all sorts of images of animals throughout the Northeast, which I really appreciate. If you ever get a coyote image, please send it to me. I'm always interested in looking at different canids and the uniqueness of individual animals. But really what I'm trying to show you here is that there's a ton of variability, and it's due to that unique genetic structure. But overall, our coyote is a larger body animal that's much more wolf looking. I would say, in particular, the two images on the top right have much more wolfy looking animals compared to that western coyote that is really only 20 to 30 pounds. These are much larger body animals, larger weight, skull size, and a lot of genetic variability in the coat color as well, which is really fascinating. Obviously, this top left-hand quarter, I'm wondering what's going on there, but these are two coyotes. I think this was from somewhere in Connecticut. So really interesting variability on canids. So why does this matter? Why am I taking you down a wormhole of canid taxonomy? So I'm going to shift gear and talk about policy frameworks now, and discuss why these taxonomic classifications are super important in the way that we actually treat these animals on the landscape. And so at the current, again, saying this with a caveat that this is at the current moment, but at the current moment, wolves do have full protection pursuant to the Federal Endangered Species Act, right? So right at this moment, there's a Section 9 prohibition, which is Section 9 of the ESA, that prohibits take of wolves, right? So you cannot hunt, harm, harass, or pursue a wolf. So essentially receiving the strongest protections a species can receive in the US. And then contrasting that to coyotes, which are one of the most deregulated species in the country. So really receive zero protection. Like I said, it's estimated that 500,000 coyotes die each year. And it's why we've chosen them as our flagship species, because of all the persecution that they receive in North America. But in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, there's a year-round, just here in the Northeast, right, year-round season, no bag limits. You can kill as many coyotes as you want year-round. Things like night hunting are allowed. And in New Hampshire and Maine, wildlife killing contests in particular are still legal. In New York, we do have a bit more of a limited season, but it's still very liberal. And from October 1st to March 31st, still no bag limits, and things like night hunting are allowed. So these are vastly different protections under the law, right? And so then going back to these animals, well, all of these animals in the Northeast at the current moment are getting lumped into that coyote classification. So they're all receiving that lack of protections despite their genetic uniqueness And despite really not knowing the genetic makeup of any of these animals, right, we can see the unique variability of them, but I don't have any DNA data on, these are all just pictures of canids in the wild. So trying to kind of highlight that there's really varied protections for wolves and coyotes across the US. The next slide does have pictures of dead coyotes and wolves. So I just wanted to give you a quick warning on that. So why does this matter? So because we have canids that have been killed in the Northeast that were later identified as wolves, right? So these animals, all three of these animals obviously look a bit more wolf-like, like some of the ones that we saw on the last slide. The one in the top right-hand corner was actually the Cooperstown wolf, which some of you might know about. So this was a canid that was thought to be a coyote, or this is, you know, an individual that went out coyote hunting, shot a, again, what he thought was a coyote, and then it was confirmed by genetic analysis to be 98% wolf. And that happened in Cooperstown or Cherry Valley, New York, right around there. It's actually the taxidermy of this particular animal is now in a museum in Albany, in the Albany area. And I can share information on that. I haven't got up there to visit yet, but I've heard that it's a great exhibit on wolves and coyotes. And yeah, I see your hand up. Are you on the?
So that immediately raises a question. So what happens to the hunter? To me, this begs for a policy change. They should, many hunters are not very good at what they do, even when they're going after deer. And to expect them to understand whether an animal that they're targeting, which they think is a coyote versus a wolf, especially with this wide variation in color, that's expecting way too much. And I think if they don't, you know, provide some type of penalty for this, any hunter is just going to use that as an excuse that, oh, I was going after a coyote.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, you're hitting the nail on the head. And this is a problem that we actually even see out west, right? Where the distinction between coyote, there's a 90-pound difference between those animals. But there's been cases where individuals have said that they thought it was a coyote. They ended up killing a wolf. And unfortunately, there's a Department of Justice policy that essentially makes that a get out of jail free card, right? So if you were a hunter and you thought you were shooting at a coyote and it ended up being a wolf, as long as you said that you thought it was a coyote, right, and actually held that belief, whether or not we can prove that that belief was actually held at the time, essentially you won't get prosecuted for killing these animals. We, in the wake of this incident, a coalition of organizations, including my own, had tried to work with the wildlife agencies throughout the Northeast to really increase hunter education. But I would say that that's asking actually a lot, right? Because these animals, like I said, I can't tell you definitively the canids that we were looking at in that slide with all the variability, right? These are animals that are very genetically diverse and very hard to identify in the field. So you're hitting the head, hitting the nail on the head and saying that this is something that's ripe for policy reform, and really why I advocate for an all canis protection, because it's really the only reasonable way to allow wolves to recover, is to protect coyotes. Now, yeah, it's going to be an uphill battle on getting that to happen, but yeah, it's definitely the direction that our organization advocates for. And it is something, I will say, it is something that previously, wildlife agencies have identified this as an issue, right? So this is from a state wildlife action plan in 2015. Vermont, the state agency said the ability of coyote hunters in the Northeast to effectively discern wolves from coyotes in the field may also influence the likelihood of natural wolf recolonization. And it went on to say that it was exceptionally difficult to expect hunters to be able to identify the difference between canids. And it is something that they know. Whether them taking action on it is a different question. Well, not a question, they're not taking action on it. So, but this kind of underscores a larger question that I've started thinking about quite a bit, and there's quite a bit of research on it, which is, what about coyotes with high wolf ancestry? And are they serving an ecological role that's varied from their Western counterparts, and a bit more of that apex or predator or keystone species role that wolves have historically served in a landscape like the Northeast? And we talked about the ecological benefits of wolves and the reintroductions that restored ecosystem health, increased biodiversity in Yellowstone National Park. So are coyotes doing that on the landscape? And the answer in the Northeast is yes, sort of, in a varied way, right? We have canids that have varying levels of wolf DNA, but studies have shown that canid packs that are dominated by more wolf ancestry have killed almost twice as much ungulate biomass per day as canids in packs dominated by coyote ancestry. So it is showing up, right? The higher percentage of wolf DNA is creating more wolf-like animals. So eastern coyotes living in areas with higher deer density have more wolf DNA. And so this is really interesting data on the landscape to show that there is a varied ecological role of our eastern coyote, which goes more to the point of offering them stronger protections, right? Because they're serving an ecological role in the absence of a species that we wiped off the landscape. And so there's a fundamental devaluing of coyotes, that no bag limits, year-round season. But with looking at the data of the role, the increasing role that they're playing in our ecosystems, really, points to us providing them more protections for their ecological benefits to our Northeast ecosystems. And then I just wanted to touch briefly on eastern wolves. So that is that closest breeding population. And this map is, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of this map kind of where that is. So this is the Ontario province in Canada. And like I said, this red patch is what's expanded here. If anyone is familiar with Algonquin Provincial Park, it's essentially a national park on the Canada side, in Canada, just north of New York. And so that is our closest breeding population of wolves, which is roughly, again, 100 miles from the New York border. Eastern wolves are a subspecies of gray wolf. That's what we consider them here in the US. But like I said, in Canada, they're considered a separate species. And canid taxonomists are still kind of debating the scientific literature around that. But what we do know is that they have a unique genomic composition. And so their ancestry is not seen in any other North American wolf population. And so unfortunately, their DNA is restricted to that these small fragmented patches of protected habitat in central Ontario, kind of primarily in the Algonquin Provincial Park, but also some provincial parks around Algonquin. And the biggest threat to, just to point out really quickly, so you'll see the different colors on this map. So eastern wolf, and then eastern coyote is purple, and then admixed coyote is yellow, and then there's admixed wolf, which is blue. And so you can see even within the park, that there's really varying levels of DNA of these animals. But what you see as you kind of get outside of the park is that there's more purple and yellow, so there's more coyotes. And that's kind of displaying a little bit of what I talked about with like coyotes being able to expand their range in the face of kind of human-dominated landscapes and human-caused mortality. And wolves need larger protected habitats in order to have sustained social structures, those pack dynamics, take down larger prey. So eastern wolves in particular are having a really hard time getting outside of Algonquin Provincial Park. And that's really due to heavy hunting and trapping that's happening around the park, also mortality by roadways, and a lack of wildlife crossings and adequate ability to kind of disperse from the park. And there's been a good amount of studies that have really identified that if we are going to get dispersal and expand the range of eastern wolves, scientists have identified that we are going to have to protect across Canis. We're going to have to protect coyotes and wolves because these individuals are hybridizing with one another. So that ability to identify between species is really difficult. And so we're really going to have to expand the protections outside these provincial park areas in order to allow wolves to, move south into the New York and Northeast region. And so I wanted to highlight that, and I wanted to, there's one paper in particular that came out recently. I think there's, a picture. I snapped a picture of that here. I think it came out just a few months ago now, that really highlighted the importance of, habitat restoration, thinking about those key wildlife corridors, but then in partnership with those things, working across the Canada and the United States to provide protections to all Canis in order to help eastern wolves expand and disperse out of Canada and into the States. So kind of gets me to my main points. I'm going to wrap up here in a few minutes. So how do we help wolves rewild the Northeast and disperse and recover in our region? I think you get my point at this point, but protection for all Canis, right? Protection for coyotes and wolves, because that is going to reduce or just remove the risk of misidentification. And it's also going to allow kind of that ecological variability to also play out, right? Coyotes with more wolf DNA are serving that more wolf-like role. So protecting them is really integral and important conservation objective for our ecosystems in the Northeast. And then the second one is going to be really difficult in this next kind of 4-year patch, thinking about the administration, but keeping wolves on the Federal Endangered Species Act. And I can't overstate the importance of this piece. Wolf protections will be under direct threat in the coming months and years, and it's going to definitely require direct advocacy in opposing those threats at the federal level, but also advocacy at the state level. And this is where our state agencies and our state policy really needs to step up to fill the gaps of what the federal government will be rolling back in terms of wildlife protections. So I urge all of you to, join me and other organizations who will definitely be strongly opposing the impending tax on the Endangered Species Act. I'll share links after this in a QR code actually on the next slide that you can sign up for our e-team. We always send out action alerts and alerts on things like Federal Endangered Species Act rollbacks and whatnot. The third need here is more research and DNA analysis of wild Canis in the Northeast. Right, we don't know the DNA makeup of a lot of our Canis. There's a lack of research going on in the Northeast. I will say this is beginning to happen. There's new DNA testing that's underway at the current moment that's using actually a really cool non-invasive sampling method where you can look at the ancestry of an animal from collecting its poop. And so you can actually run that through DNA analysis and begin to better understand the ancestry of animals, which is really amazing kind of widely applicable sampling method that we can start using in the Northeast to gather more data on ancestry. And then there's things like the New York Wolf Bill, which if I know we kind of chat about it at the beginning of this talk, but it's a bill that was introduced last legislative session, and it's set to be introduced this legislative session, which essentially is promoting more collaboration with the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York to start to research and do more DNA analysis on coyotes and Canis that are being killed in the state. like I said, at the current moment, there's no reporting or any really regulatory requirements around coyote killing. This would actually help us collect more data on the size of canids that are being killed, the weight of canids that are being killed, and also doing DNA analysis on some of those larger bodied animals in order to look at the genetic makeup of these canids on the landscape. And then the last one is just a general note. My organization, like I said, is working on fostering compassionate coexistence with these species. And there's so much work that needs to be done in increasing social tolerance and public perception of not only wolves, of coyotes. I'm sure you all are aware that coyotes aren't the most loved species by many across the United States. And so we're always working to increase education about these species and kind of roll back negative attitudes and promote more positive attitudes that continue to hinder their protection. So promoting coexistence is really key. And then this was the New York Wolf Bill. I always forget I have animated slides. That was introduced last legislative session, will be introduced again. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that the work that I do is part of a regional coalition that formed, the Northeast Wolf Recovery Alliance. And I'll share a link in the chat after I wrap up here. But I'm working in really close coordination with a ton of other really great regional and state-based groups throughout the Northeast. And this alliance formed in response to that Cooperstown wolf from 2021 that was killed in New York, and really formed around the idea of what protections were needed to stop this from happening. And so we continue to work on promoting positive policy changes, more DNA analysis of Canis, and kind of what I've highlighted here in this slide is kind of the focal of that group. And then, yeah, last slide. If you're familiar with QR codes, you can scan that to get taken to sign up for our e-team. I'll also share a link in the chat if folks are interested in signing up for Project Coyote's e-team and learning more about wild carnivore protection, both wolves and coyotes and other species across North America. Yeah, thank you again all so much. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions and comments and anything that you all might have. Or yeah, so thank you. I really appreciate you having me.
Very well done. Thank you for this excellent presentation and for your efforts on this work. I've got a couple of questions and I'll open it up to the floor. One thing early on in your presentation, you mentioned that connectivity to the population of wolves in southeastern Canada is important. Could they naturally swim, like maybe through the Thousand Islands to migrate to the Western Adirondacks? Is that a viable thing for them to do if they were not harassed?
Yeah. So historically, that Thousand Island region was, I think it was called the stepping stones of considered like the stepping stones of connectivity between those two regions, right? But that, increasingly the St. Lawrence River in particular is becoming a difficult passage corridor. One, because of climate change, right? The St. Lawrence River is not freezing over like it historically has in a lot of areas. So wolves, definitely, large carnivores were definitely using those kind of the frozen river, kind of passing across the frozen river. Coyotes and canids do swim. We have seen dispersal to even in the Long Island area, which is some of the newer coyote range that's being expanded into Long Island. There's been documentation of wolves actually swimming across the Long Island Sound. So we know that Canis does swim. Mountain lions disperse in, I know that's a different species, right? But some large carnivores do disperse over water. But the St. Lawrence is also a difficult passage because of just the human development that's happening along the river in that region. So it is possible. We have seen species connectivity throughout that region, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for sure. So it's something to really think about in terms of like protecting those corridor areas.
So it sounds like we need to advocate more for an active reintroduction into the Adirondacks, which I'm certainly in favor of. And the other thing is, as soon as possible, if we can get legislative backing for this, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this. Is there much in the way of possible support to ban this ridiculous hunting without any limits of coyotes in New York State? That seems like this should be easily done as long as somebody cares about it. This is not a difficult question. And there's good reason to do this because many regions of New York State are overrun by deer, and that means that our forests are not able to regenerate. And once the old trees start to die and fall down, they're being attacked by invasive species as well. And drought and wildfires are the other big threat that's accelerated by climate change. So if we humans care about forests, we should help the coyotes and the wolves.
I agree. Here, here. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think the ecological benefits of the species really can't be understated. I will say that, you know, from our organizational viewpoint, there's a few kind of, I would say, prerequisites to thinking about reintroduction in the Northeast, and that would be really reining in and strictly limiting coyote hunting. Because you don't see a viability of a wolf reintroduction for the well-being of the wolves that would be reintroduced and their sustainability in the region without starting to prohibit, you know, the kind of unlimited season that coyotes are subjected to. So we don't focus on, just, you know, coming from our organizational standpoint, in promoting reintroduction, because we just think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in reforming the regulations around coyotes in particular. So that's kind of the core of our focus at this moment. Yeah.
Does the New York bill include a request to ban hunting of coyotes in addition to wolves?
It doesn't, not because I don't want to put it in there. I would advocate for maybe, you know, I think there's some strategy that's gone into the thoughts behind that bill in particular, and I think it's a great bill to increase the research of wolves in you know, of Canis and coyotes in the Northeast and potential wolves. But I think that there's more steps that we could take in terms of limiting coyote hunting in particular. And I think that might have to be a separate bill, just because of the strategy of that bill kind of in a different direction. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Jim?
I have a question.
Oops.
Oh, you go ahead. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you, Jim. So obviously hunters don't want competition, and out west, I know the issues revolve a lot around cattle and ranchers.
Mm-hmm.
Is it hunters that are the main problem, besides having some type of a reasonable corridor for reintroduction in the east?
Yeah. So we see common threads of both the hunting and trapping community being kind of the major opposition. You know, there is some opposition for coyotes in particular from farming communities in the Northeast, but not to the extent that it exists, I would say, in the West. You know, I worked with the Northeast Organic Farming Association, and they have been promoting really proactive coexistence with coyotes and large carnivores. Obviously, you know, the farming community isn't a monolith, and there's a lot of varied opinions. I would say that there likely would be opposition from some of the farming community, like you know, like exists out west with the ranching community. But I see major kind of pushback coming from hunting and trapping contingency.
Am I up?
Yes.
Okay. I got three darn questions. One is this terminology between Canis and Canid.
Yeah.
How does that work? I hadn't heard about Canis until this presentation was announced. I had always thought Canid and the plural would be Canids.
Yeah. Yeah, and I might, I'm still getting used to terminology, so I might have used it a little more interchangeably than I should. So Canis is the family of Canis, which includes Canis lupus, Canis latrans, so coyotes, wolves, and also Canis familiaris. So I saw that cute dog that was on your lap at one point. So he falls in this on this Canis family as well. And then Canidia is actually the genus of which Canis falls under, right? So foxes are not considered, they're not in the Canis family, but they are in Canid genus. So it's just a bit of structure, like the taxonomic structure. And we try to say Canis because that more defines that family of coyotes, wolves, and even domestic dogs is, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Number two, we had an outing a couple of years ago to an outfit in Shenango County called Wolf Mountain. And it's I guess he's by ancestry, the guy that runs it is a Mohawk. And he has this ranch basically for wolves, and he's got them from various places, and it's an ongoing concern. Are you familiar with Wolf Mountain?
I'm not, no. So is it like a sanctuary facility or?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it is.
Okay,
So,
interesting. Yeah.
I can send you contact information if you'd like.
Yeah, I would love to, learn a little bit more about them. That would be
yeah.
awesome. Yeah, I haven't heard
Yeah.
of them before.
Yeah, it's not too far from here. Last question. Are you familiar with any New York State legislators that are favorable to these protections?
Yeah, definitely. So that wolf bill, that's really focused on that increasing genetic analysis and more kind of DNA work on canids. That is sponsored by Senator Hoylman out of New York City. I think he's Manhattan District. And then Representative Robert Carroll, who also was the sponsor of the Wildlife Crossings Bill, which was, the legislative bill around wildlife crossings that was kind of moving forward and passed the Senate and the House this legislative session. And I would say that there's a whole slew of co-sponsors on that legislation as well. I know Senator Pete Harcum in particular is one that's been very positive on this issue.
Okay. Do you have a bill number?
Yeah, let me unshare my screen and wait, how do I do that? And I will get you the bill number. And I guess this will be actually the bill from last legislative session, because we're entering the new legislative session, we'll get a new bill number, but I'll share that with you, and then you could see that list of co-sponsors from last legislative session. And I will share some of those links that actually I said I would share. This is to sign up for our e-team for folks that were interested. And then one more, I'm sharing all sorts of things. I will share a little bit more information about the Northeast Wolf Recovery Alliance as well.
I'll jump in with a question, Renee.
Yeah.
For New York, the population of the coyote, I imagine, is pretty closely watched by the DEC. And have they indicated anything, or do you know of anything with changes to the hunting that they allow based on the population sizes?
You know, it's actually so the DEC, unfortunately, when it comes to coyotes, they really don't have any concrete data, and that's in part because they don't require any reporting of canids that are killed. And so hunters will get a hunting license, but in terms of how many animals are actually being killed across the state and information around that, they just have rough estimates from some of the research that's gone on, in particular with like SUNY ESF, some of the other universities that have looked at population a little bit, but they don't have good data on how many hunters are out there and how many coyotes are being killed yearly. We actually, you know, very supportive of banning wildlife killing contests. But I will say that actually was more information than we had ever, the big information source for us, actually, because with those coyote killing contests, you could see the number of animals that were being killed, the number of hunters that were participating, and then the sizes of the animals that were coming in at those competitions. And that was more data than I've ever seen the DEC really provide on population of coyotes. They know that they say they know that they're doing well when I've had conversations with them, because they know that coyotes do well even when they're hunted. But in terms of having concrete data on that, they really kind of lack that information.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I got one other, I guess maybe a closing one here. Renee, what's your feeling if New York banned the hunting of both coyotes and wolves so that we took preemptive protection? Hopefully, the incoming federal administration doesn't undo the federal endangered species act protection of wolves, but maybe if they do, maybe if New York puts in protection for both wolves and coyotes, do you think that the wolves on their own might be able to establish a viable population and form into packs and be successful, especially in the Adirondacks, perhaps Catskills too?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I do think that there's opportunity to recolonize. I think that the dispersing animals that we've seen over the last 2 decades, although it's been limited, the number of individuals, I think it shows signs of the tenacity of wolves being able to disperse long distances and recolonize habitats. I think the prerequisite there too would be we do also need action on the Canada side in order to help create that dispersal corridor and reduce human caused mortality that's happening on the Canada side too. So it really is going to take a binational, I think, cooperation from both sovereign governments in order to kind of see that happen. But yeah, I do. Animals and wolves and coyotes in particular amaze me at their ability to adapt and survive. And if we provide them adequate protections, I do see them, being able to disperse and recolonize habitat.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Renee. Last call for questions. Anybody else have any comments or questions?
Very informative program. Thank you, Renee.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you having me. And yeah, if any follow-up questions or anything, I'm sure you can feel free to share my email. And yeah.
This is Jim. I live in the city of Binghamton, and we hear coyotes from time to time.
Yeah, I know. I didn't get into you know, some of my more coyote focused talk, but isn't it amazing? Their howls, they have like that crazy vocalizations that just sound almost like eerie and very cool. And yeah.
Sometimes like an ambulance.
Yes, and responsive to like other high-pitched noises, which is, yeah. If I sometimes will play coyote calls, you know, YouTube and stuff, and my cat goes running under the bed. He like has an instinctual reaction that's like, this is something I should not be, you know, out in for. So
That's good to know. We have a cat ourselves, so I've been wondering about that because we have coyotes in this area and we hear them occasionally, you know, in the middle of the night too. So, and we'll keep this in mind. This is a fantastic talk. You know, there are several of us that participate on the what's called the Atlantic Chapter Legislative Committee, which is the next level up of Sierra Club. It's the middle level. It's this particular Atlantic chapter covers all of New York State, and we have regular meetings at that level of what's called the Legislative Committee, and we're going to start doing that soon again to prepare for what we advocate for in the upcoming 2025 legislative session, and we keep a keen eye out and also try to do a preemptive communication with the governor's office prior to her releasing her state budget statement as well.
Yeah.
So we will keep this in mind because this is super important. And as I mentioned before we started the meeting recording, I have cared about wolves since I was a young teenager. So if we could help bring them back, that would be awesome. And if my father was still alive, he would be super happy about that too. So thank you for the work you're doing. And thank you for this excellent presentation.
of course. No, and thank you guys so much for all of the advocacy and the work that you do across the issues in New York State. I more than ever really seek solidarity in all of the environmental organizations and wildlife organizations that are working on these issues. We can't all engage on every single one as much as we want to. So knowing that you guys exist and that you're such a voice for the environment in New York, it makes me exceptionally grateful as a New Yorker. So really appreciate all of you as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank
You,
you.
everybody.